Ororo, Charles.
I love what you've done with your hair.
You too. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice.
Henry, you are always welcome here. You're a part of this place.
I have news.
Is it Eric?
No, though we have been making some progress on that front. Mystique was recently apprehended.
Who's the furball?
Hank McCoy, Secretary of Mutant Affairs.
Right. The secretary. Nice suit.
Henry, this is Logan. He's,
Wolverine. I hear you're quite an animal.
Look who's talking.
You know Magneto's gonna come get Mystique, right?
Magneto's not the problem. At least not our most pressing one. A major pharmaceutical company has developed a mutant antibody. A way to suppress the mutant X gene.
Suppress?
Permanently. They're calling it a cure.
Well, that's ridiculous. You can't cure being a mutant.
Well, scientifically speaking...
Since when did we become a disease? How can anybody in their right...
They're announcing it now.
These so-called mutants are people, just like us. Their affliction is nothing more than a disease, a corruption of healthy cellular activity. But I stand here today to tell you that there's hope. And this site, once the world's most famous prison, will now be the source of freedom for all mutants who choose it. Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present the answer to mutation. Finally, we have a cure.
Who would want this cure? I mean, what kind of coward would take it just to fit in?
Is it cowardice to save oneself from persecution? Not all of us can fit in so easily. You don't shed on the furniture.
Well, for all we know, the government helped cook this up.
I can assure you the government had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, well, I've heard that before.
My boy, I have been fighting for mutant rights since before you had claws.
Did he just call me boy?
Is it true? They can cure us?
Yes, Rogue, it appears to be true.
No, Professor. They can't cure us. You want to know why? Because there's nothing to cure. Nothing's wrong with you. Or any of us, for that matter.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest, a fellow podcaster, and that's Josh Chumbiray. Josh, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So what I like to do with new guests is give them a chance to talk a little bit about themselves. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about you and what you do?
Awesome. Hey, listeners. My name's Josh. I host a podcast called Super Scary. We primarily cover horror movies, but we also dive into some other stuff like sci-fi and superhero films. We just recently recorded with Perry for Morbius, which was fun to kind of rip into, a really bad movie and give our suggestions of how we would make it better. So we have a lot of fun on my podcast. Otherwise, I really enjoy superhero films. So I was happy that Perry reached out to me because I was kind of looking for somebody to share my love of superhero films with. So I'm excited to dive into this today.
So let's start there and talk a little bit about how you got into superhero movies and all that stuff. What's kind of your background as far as superhero movies go, or comics, or anything like that?
Yeah. So I believe I watched the first X-Men film, and I think that came out in like 2000, right? So yeah, I was born in 92, so I was like 8 or 10 years old when I first watched that, and I really connected with the X-Men. And I think me being gay as well, kind of, their themes of kind of being outcasts in their community, or in society in general, that really kind of resonated with me, even though at the time, obviously I didn't really understand until I was much older, but, now I really kind of connect with it on that level. But otherwise, the X-Men in general, I think, are just really creative because they have a lot of, creative powers, and I like the diversity in the group. Whereas sometimes with, you know, Justice League or Avengers, even, they all kind of blend together at a certain point, for at least for me. So the X-Men really kind of called to me, but I really enjoy Marvel a little more than DC. But of course, growing up, I feel like in the 90s, like the Superman and Batman cartoons, and even X-Men and Spider-Man, all those kind of classics, I still kind of go back to those, gravitate towards those. So
I think a lot of that, and we've talked a lot about this on the show before. It's whatever kind of like grabs you first, like if it's Marvel or DC, whatever kind of grabs you, that kind of makes you, the fan for them for life. So with you, it was Marvel. With me too, it was Marvel. It was also the X-Men. I'm about 9 years older than you, so it actually was the animated series. So I was in high school when the movie came out, so it was the animated series that drew me in, and then ended up moving from there to the comics and on. But other guests I've had on who they got into like Superman or Batman first, and then they end up being a DC fan hardcore now more than Marvel. So yeah, I'm very much kind of the thing. Even though I do love a whole lot of DC stuff now, Marvel is still kind of what I just kind of like naturally gravitate towards as a result.
Yeah, definitely. And also with the X-Men movies in particular, I feel like they, I think Spider-Man technically came out. Did it come out before the original
Spider-Man?
X-Men movie?
Spider-Man came out in 2002, and then X-Men came out in 2000.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So my memory serves correct. X-Men kind of set the tone for like the early 2000s.
Right.
Good and bad.
Yeah.
In some regards, but I really enjoyed, I recently rewatched them like during the pandemic. And then of course with Disney acquiring the Fox properties, they're all kind of popping up on Disney Plus now. So I'm just like, oh, great. Another excuse to watch it. So, but the movie we're talking about today, The Last Stand, I hadn't really watched. I want to say like a good 5 years. Like it's been a good bit.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed rewatching this. And I feel like I'm not as critical on it now after, some of the other X-Men movies that have come out since, and even, just Marvel properties in general. There's some good and bad. So I'm not as critical on this as maybe, like 10 years ago watching this.
I think I've gone through phases where I've been more critical and less critical of it as throughout the years. I remember when it came out, I was very critical of it at the time. Especially because it kind of divided the fandom into these two groups at the time it came out, because we'll get into the backstory. But before we get into that, another thing I want to ask new guests is, what are you kind of interested in now? Not necessarily for your podcast or anything like that, but what are you just kind of like into at the moment? Can be movies, comics, TV, video game, whatever it is.
Yeah. I really want to play the new Pokemon Violet and Scarlet game. Even though if you follow it on social media at all, the kind of glitches and stuff that are going on with it is kind of wild and funny. So I really want to check that out eventually. But other than that, I really enjoy playing RPG video games. So I'm kind of replaying a bunch of Final Fantasy games and that type of stuff. So, and as far as like TV and movies, I really have to catch up on a bunch of stuff on Disney Plus, like Andor. I'm going to be watching this weekend with my dad when he comes into town, because he's a big Star Wars junkie like me. So I have to watch that. I have to watch She-Hulk, even though
She-Hulk is so good.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm sure you've seen the discourse on it, on Twitter and such.
So ridiculous. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. So I'm I figured it was kind of, blown out of proportion, but
Oh yeah.
so I'm excited to watch that. I got about halfway through Moon Knight and then kind of fell off because I think I was watching other stuff. Like, there's just so much on Disney Plus now that's kind of like being thrown at you every week. So I feel like I have a huge backlog right now.
I know. I've got. We're subscribed to Disney, HBO Max, and Netflix, and just like I've got a huge backlog of stuff, and I'm still trying to catch up with the last season of Young Justice on HBO. And now, just this morning before we started recording, I saw that HBO Max is going to be pulling Westworld off its service, and I haven't finished that yet. So now I got to get back into that. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I feel like Warner Brothers is going through a very interesting transition, I guess is the word. And I know that James Gunn recently hopped on as their kind of, I guess they're Kevin Feige for the DC universe. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But I don't know. It's a mess.
Which is I mean, so far that seems to be the one good decision that Zaslav has made is putting James Gunn in charge of the DC stuff. But all this other stuff, he's trashing HBO Max so he can merge it with Discovery, so it can, he's going to be flooding it with all this reality TV crap and all this stuff that people actually, like me, signed up for HBO for. We're going to have to get it out somewhere else, or it may not be released at all because he doesn't want to pay residuals. So, I mean, at this rate, they're just going to end up driving like a whole new golden age of piracy, it seems.
Yeah. And I think it'll be interesting. I'm sure there's some sort of bootleg version of the Batwoman
Batgirl
floating out there, or Batgirl, I'm sorry, floating out there somewhere, which I don't know why they just didn't go ahead and release it. But,
I know, all for damn tax cuts, ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a shame because I think it would have, even though it was, I think it was only going to be released on HBO Max,
right? Yeah,
but even so, I think it would have done decently well. I felt like it had like a decent amount of star power, especially with Michael Keaton in it,
right?
That it kind of the whole multiverse aspect of it. I think it would have really. I think I would have enjoyed it because I do like Michael Keaton's version of Batman from the late 80s,
right?
And well, speaking of that, that's another the Batman and Robin movie. I think was like my first live action Batman movie that
that's a start.
Yeah, right. Which it's a guilty pleasure of mine, I'll admit. I love Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. I think it's iconic in my opinion. Others may say otherwise, but I think it's just like a fun campy movie, even though it's
I've actually we did an episode on it a while back, and with my late co-host, and one of the things that we kind of felt about is like we both kind of came around on it because if you watch it as a modern reinterpretation of like the 66 Batman, it's actually kind of entertaining. I mean, it's not a good movie, I wouldn't say, but it's still it's entertaining. And I had watched Batman Forever recently. We got an episode coming up. Well, by the time this comes out, the Batman Forever episode will be out. But when I rewatched that, I actually kind of changed my opinion on those Batman films. Because at first it was, Batman and Robin was the worst one of them. But now I'm like, no, actually Batman Forever is probably the worst one of them. It's just like a total mess. Also unbelievably horny. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just a kid watching, that movie, it's just weird. The Batman and Robin movie, the bat nipples, the weird, Mr. Freeze, it's a lot, but I enjoy it. I watch it a lot.
I had also read this kind of came out after Joel Schumacher passed away, and I had mentioned this when we talked about the episode, but you saying that you were born in 92 and that you're gay, a lot of that made me remember that I had read that a lot of LGBTQ people around around your same age, even my generation too, a little bit, found Batman and Robin really influential to them in their like self-discovery journeys.
Yeah, I've definitely seen like reports about that, and I would agree to a certain degree. I mean, like Robin's in freaking underwear, basically. Like, I mean, and even I mean, in my circles on Twitter and stuff, you know, a lot of the there's a lot of discourse about Nightwing and his voluptuous butt, if you will, in the tights, and the kind of clamoring about it with Gotham Knights. I think there was an early version of it where he didn't have a nice butt, and everybody was like, "No," like canceled. Yeah, so I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, Dick Grayson seems to be a huge thirst trap for both gay fans and female fans, I've noticed.
Hey, I will say amen to that.
But anyway, so today we're, like you mentioned, we were talking about X-Men: The Last Stand, and like I'd started to talk about before, this movie was kind of a total mess going into production. I know you were very young when this came out, so I'm not sure how much you were kind of privy to at the time, but Singer had done X2, and one of the things I hate about this now is this is kind of putting me in a position where I have to defend Bryan Singer, which is something I hate doing because the guy's a monster. But
yeah.
But at the time, you know, Singer had done X2, and he had started to work on like a treatment for the third movie. He had planned to have the whole focus be like the Phoenix, bring in Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club. I think he'd actually wanted Sigourney Weaver to play Emma Frost, was kind of like his casting idea for it.
Yeah.
And it was going to be kind of like this three-way battle between the X-Men, the Brotherhood, and the Hellfire Club, trying to, you know, take control of the Phoenix in some form. And that was going to be the through line of the entire movie. Problem was, Fox kept dragging their feet on whether or not they wanted to make a third movie. And they were just kind of like, oh, you know, we haven't decided yet. And so then Singer got offered the chance to do a Superman movie. And Superman movies were always kind of like in this weird flux at that time, because the Superman Lives project with Nicolas Cage and Tim Burton was kind of killed after Batman and Robin. And then there were all these different versions that were floating around. J.J. Abrams was working on one at one point, and there's Brett Ratner was involved at one point, and you know,
right.
I think M. Night Shyamalan was even involved at one point on it, and it was just like all these different treatments and scripts flying around. Wolfgang Peterson was involved in a Superman Batman movie at one point too.
Oh wow!
And then finally, they had approached Singer, and Singer was a huge fan of the Richard Donner Superman films. And apparently Kevin Spacey had said that on the set of The Usual Suspects, Singer was telling anyone who would listen about his idea for a better Superman 3. And so this was something that he'd apparently wanted to do for a while. So when Warner Brothers came to him and asked him if he'd be interested in doing Superman, he asked them, oh, I would do it if you let me do it as a sequel to Superman 2. And they said, okay. And then he went on to that. And then as soon as Fox found out about this, they're like, what are you doing? You're supposed to do X-Men 3. And he's like, but you guys told me you're not ready to do it. They're like, no, we're doing it now, and you have to decide, are you going to do Superman or are you going to do X-Men? So Singer's like, well, I already signed with Warner Brothers, so I'm going to be doing X-Men. And Fox like, okay, fine, we're getting another director, and we are fast tracking the third X-Men movie into production, and we're going to have it come out the same summer as Superman Returns. And it's like this whole rush production. So they brought on Matthew Vaughn at first to do it, and then Vaughn ended up quitting like about a week or so before filming, because he said that the schedule Fox was proposing was just ridiculous and it was like impossible to do. So he dropped out of that. Later he would come back to do First Class, and then finally they settled on Brett Ratner, which Jesus Christ, Brett Ratner. I mean, it's just he's the kind of director you go to when you want a film to be on time and under budget. That's basically why you hire Brett Ratner. You don't hire Brett Ratner because you think he's a visionary filmmaker.
Yeah, that and you could definitely tell in this movie compared to the first two, kind of the quality of it, because like the first two movies have a pretty good storyline for the most part,
Oh yeah.
and then this one kind of goes off the rails a little bit, and I think they try to do a little too much, try to
Yes.
combine two different storylines, which upon my rewatch this week, I'm like, okay, maybe it's not as bad,
Mhm.
but um, but yeah, you can definitely tell the
Yeah.
stark difference.
Well, that was one of the things because Fox was pushing very hard for it to just be about the Brotherhood and the Cure stuff, and then the screenwriters were actually pushing back because they wanted to include the stuff with Jean. And that's kind of why, like, for like the entire second half of the movie, Jean just kind of stands around, literally stands around doing nothing.
Pretty much, and I feel like that. I just love the Phoenix Saga so much. Like Jean
Mhm.
Grey is probably my favorite character from the X-Men, just because she kind of starts out as kind of a damsel in distress in a
Mhm.
way in most parts, because she's trying to figure out her powers and the place on the team. And then, in the 80s, in the comics, Chris Claremont, does an amazing job with the Phoenix Saga.
Right.
So when I remember reading those comics, it was probably shortly after the movies came out, and I think I told you, Perry, that I have these like huge like anthology books of
Mhm.
like the Chris Claremont run, and I recently just found them again, so I'm going to be reading that this weekend too. But anyway, I think the actress who plays Jean does a really good job in this movie.
Mhm.
Famke Jensen, I
Famke
think is how you
Jensen. Yeah.
say her
Yeah.
name. Yeah, she does an amazing job in all three of these movies, and I think
Mhm.
she was great in kind of this dual personality. Like you can tell in her face that there's a stark difference between her playing Phoenix and playing Jean,
Yes.
and I feel like they should have just stuck with the Phoenix storyline. And I think, I don't know if it was Ratner or who was the original. Oh, Vaughn was
Matthew
I think
Vaughn.
the
Yeah.
one who's, yeah, I think Vaughn was the one who mentioned that he would have done this as like a two-part movie, and kind of incorporated, like you said, the Hellfire Club, which I think would have made a better
Mhm.
movie in the long run. So
Right. Yeah. Apparently that I didn't read about the making it a two-parter, but that makes so much sense because Fox was really sold on this idea of this being the final movie, at which is why it's called The Last Stand. So yeah, they were really intent on this idea of this being like the final movie in the trilogy, and then after that, they were kind of going to close the books on these movies, and they were going to move on to other stuff because they're already doing like some early work on X-Men Origins Wolverine at this point, and so they had a bunch of
Mm.
rules for like what characters they could use in this movie, what characters they couldn't, because they wanted to save some for Wolverine. Like Gambit was originally intended by almost everyone who worked in this movie. Gambit was intended to be in this, but Fox wanted him in X-Men Origins instead, so he was pushed off and kept for that. Like the convoy scene, he was supposed to be one of the prisoners in that, for example. Another script
Oh,
treatment had him as kind of like the spoiler person in the Bobby Rogue romance, so he was supposed to be involved in that at one point. Um,
oh.
and someone, I can't remember who it was, but someone who was involved said they had wanted Keanu Reeves actually to play Gambit, which would have been interesting choice at that time, I think.
Yeah, I think now, as we look at it in 2022, I think it's kind of a missed opportunity to
Mm-hmm.
just incorporate those, and instead of just saving them,
Yeah.
because now we kind of look back, and I mean, like there was supposed to be a solo Gambit movie with
Mm-hmm.
Channing Tatum for like the longest time,
Right.
which teenage me was excited about that because I was obsessed with Channing Tatum for a little bit, but I. But now looking back, I'm like, oh, I'm kind of glad that movie didn't get
Mm-hmm.
made. But in general, I think they should have just built out the universe and just,
Yeah.
I mean, clearly these movies were popular enough. I feel like, even though this third one, you know, wasn't necessarily critically acclaimed by any means, but I think it's definitely a missed opportunity. You know?
Yeah, and they'd made a lot of. You could tell that they were planning on this being like the last film then, and they had they'd kind of pushed back, like the writers and Ratner had pushed back on that a little bit. So they kind of tried to leave the door open for stuff where they could. So, like for example, Cyclops' death, they never show his body, so it's kind of left hanging open that maybe he's still alive. They bring back Professor X at the end of the movie in a post-credit scene.
Right.
There's the hint at the end where Magneto might have his powers back. So all of this is like, it's like they close the door and they're like, we're going to leave it open just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the sequels that come after this are sequels quotations. You know, especially the Wolverine movie where he's in Japan and they bring back
Famke Janssen, yeah.
Famke Janssen, yeah, thank you. You know, it's not great. Like, I wish they would have just, you know, scrapped kind of focusing on Wolverine so much. And I think that's what I like. I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. I think it's perfect casting. And I feel like a lot of, you know, the early 2000s movies, like even with Fantastic Four as well, I feel like they were perfectly cast for the time. But in particular, I think Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart are always going to be like my Professor X and Magneto, and same with Jean Grey too. Famke Janssen, I think, just nails it. But yeah,
I mean, the only castings that I have a problem with in these movies, it's really just Halle Berry is probably the only one I have a problem with, because she's just, well, also in the later movies, I've got a problem with Evan Peters as Quicksilver, just because that's not Quicksilver. Like Quicksilver, Aaron Taylor Johnson in Age of Ultron, that is Quicksilver from the comics.
Right.
Evan Peters is basically Impulse from DC. So I've never really. I know he's very popular with a lot of the fans of these movies, but I've just never been able to accept Evan Peters as Quicksilver because of that. And same thing with Halle Berry as Storm. Like, it's just part of it is the scripts don't do her any favors in these movies, but also it's like they keep putting her into this role. Whenever she does get some sort of chance to shine, they move her into like stereotypical angry black woman instead of, you know, what Storm is in the comics. And that's always been a huge disappointment to me in these movies.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's the fight scene in Jean's house is pretty good, but I feel like Storm is not really shown in a great light. Like, it's just kind of a you know, punching, kicking, whatever.
The constant whirlwind thing got annoying. Yeah.
Right. That. And like, why not show off her powers more? Like, I feel like we never really see the full extent of Storm's powers in any of the X-Men films. So I'm hoping with the MCU now having the rights to X-Men that we kind of see the X-Men shine a little more.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we've seen a great display of, you know, Wolverine's powers. I feel like we've kind of beat that to the ground. So I'm hoping that some of these other like Iceman, for example, and even Rogue, like Rogue is another one of my favorites, and I feel like they just do her so dirty in these early movies.
They do,
like, she does nothing. Like like she's basically wearing gloves the entire time. She could touch no one.
You know, we had covered the first X-Men movie on one of our early episodes, and one of the things I noted at the time is that Rogue in that movie, she's basically young Kitty Pryde. Like, if you go back and you read those early issues with Kitty Pryde, that's basically exactly who Rogue is. And it's just like so much of that character is just missing from these movies. I mean, I can't hold Anna Paquin at fault for any of that, because that's just the way these scripts are written. But yeah, she gets done dirty in these. Halle Berry is just completely miscast in all these movies. Another one who just gets completely shafted, even though he gives one of the greatest subdued performances is James Marsden. Like he is,
Yeah.
he does so much with so little. Like he can't show his eyes at all, but still he's able to convey. I was surprised when we watched that first X-Men movie, and I had realized going back and watching it, just how cool and collected Cyclops is throughout that entire thing. Like Wolverine's constantly trying to piss him off, and he's constantly trying to get him to react. And Scott's just having none of it. He's just like really calm and collected. And the first time he meets it, and Wolverine grabs him and gets on him, and Scott just kind of looks at him, and he just kind of looks over at Professor X, like, "Listen, can you pull this guy down, or else can I blast this fucker?" And he's just total cool professional the whole time. And then and in some of those deleted scenes, you ever seen some of the deleted scenes in the first X-Men movie, he gets a chance to, we see more of his relationship with Professor X, with Jean, and he's such a good actor, and he just gets totally shafted in these movies. And then in this one too, because there was also, because of Fox's desire to compete with Warner Brothers with Superman, they had kind of like a casting wars going on, because Bryan Singer had asked a bunch of people to come and be in Superman Returns. So like Famke Janssen, he had wanted in, Shawn Ashmore, he had wanted, James Marsden, obviously, probably a few more too. And then Fox started this kind of like casting war. They told these actors, you can be in X-Men or you can be in Superman, but you can't be in both. So Jansen and Ashmore, they ended up going with the X-Men. And Marsden said, "You guys, Singer is giving me more to do in this Superman movie than you guys gave me to do in 2 damn movies. All the scenes you had me do in the first 2 X-Men movies, you cut. So I'm going to go be in Superman then instead."
Yeah.
And it's true, like he gets more to do in that one movie than he got to do in 3 X-Men movies. But then eventually they had kind of reached a compromise, and they were able to bring him in for a little bit here. And it's just to kill him off. His screen time is like maybe 5-10 minutes tops in this movie, but even still, but even still, in that time though, he gives probably the most emotional performance in the movie.
Yeah, the range of emotions that he's showing, even with him wearing the basic sunglasses, like it's pretty damn good. And it's a shame that he was only in the movie for, like you said, I think less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Like he kind of has like a banter with Wolverine, and then he's like, "Okay, I'm gonna go try to find my potentially deceased girlfriend." BRB, and then obviously he gets killed off, and it's wild. It
is. It's just, yeah, but and they try to. I will say one of the best things about this movie though is Kelsey Grammer as Beast.
Oh yes. Talk about perfect casting, right? Like it, and the makeup and the hair, everything about him is just spot on. And I really wish that they would have brought him back for more movies, or I don't know, like team him up with Wolverine in one of these movies, like anything.
Well, the makeup thing, I'm kind of iffy on the makeup. Like it works for the most part, but like when he's in the costume and everything, I'm just kind of like, this is not working. But for the most part, it works. But just Grammer's performance though, like he is exactly Beast from the comics. Like from that first introduction scene, you see him hanging from the ceiling as he's reading a magazine. And awesome. Just like the wit, the intelligence, he's, and just like his tone of voice, like the way he speaks, it's perfect for Beast. And even when he says the iconic line from the comics, "Oh my stars and garters," I lost my shit when I heard that in the theaters. And it's so odd though when you compare it to Nicholas Hoult in the later movies, because Nicholas Hoult is not at all Beast. Like completely divorced from that character.
Yeah. And I think a big issue with the like kind of newer crop of the X-Men films is that they were trying to make the cast younger instead of just kind of rebooting it, even if they used Patrick Stewart again as Professor X, just kind of, and again now with the MCU kind of establishing a multiverse or whatnot, I think if they were to reboot it now, they can make an argument for bringing some of these people back and
Right.
just kind of calling it, a new timeline or whatever. But I think a big draw from this newer batch of X-Men films is like they're trying to de-age the cast basically, and we see that with, again, Jean Grey. Like I think Sophie Turner is a great actress, but like that Dark Phoenix film was just so bad compared to this, and that's probably why I give this a little bit more of a pass.
Yeah, and I said that we covered Dark Phoenix a while back, and I had mentioned this when I covered that too. It's unbelievable that they screwed up Dark Phoenix so much in this movie, and then they're like, okay, we're going to do it again. We're going to do it right. And somehow they managed to screw it up even worse. But even more than that is they brought in the same writer who screwed it up the first time, and they give it to him, and they're like, do it again, and this time also direct it for your first director debut. And I'm just like, what did you think was gonna happen here?
Yeah, and you're setting yourself up to fail by saying we're gonna get it right this time, and use it, and basically making the same exact mistakes.
Yeah,
and just convoluted plot, like not focusing on the right things, shitty writing, like
trying to shoehorn in Magneto and the Brotherhood into that whole thing as well. The exact same mistakes.
Exact same mistakes. And I think they should have just went the Hellfire Club route and just, because that's really none of the X-Men movies really bring in the Hellfire Club, and I feel like that's such a big portion of the history of
we get them in
X-Men in a way.
We get them in First Class, but
that's true, yeah.
But it's weird because to your point though, it's not like the Hellfire, it's like a proto Brotherhood, because Kevin Bacon, as good, as much fun as his performance is, that's not Sebastian Shaw. That's Magneto light.
Right.
Right down to him wearing the helmet.
Literally. And I was just like, oh God, like, come on, man. Overall, First Class is one of the better, movies of the franchise. But yeah. I would just love to see a good version of the Hellfire Club, because I like Emma Frost too. I like all the telepathic, telekinetic mutants, I feel like.
Did you ever watch did you watch the Gifted TV series?
I watched a little bit of it. I need to go back and kind of rewatch it. Because I know that Polaris is in it a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
she's a big part of it. But also they work in the Hellfire Club, and the Hellfire Club in that is much closer to what they are in the comics than they were in these movies.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, I haven't watched a whole lot of that. I think I watched like the first 3 episodes, and then again kind of fell off because I think at the time there was a lot going on.
Yeah. It gets so much better after those first 3 episodes. Like the rest,
nice.
Like those first 3 episodes, it was a little bit kind of slow, but and even like the premise, like it was kind of marketed really badly because they put all the focus on this family, when really the show's a lot bigger than that. It's actually a really good show, and it gave a lot of lesser known X-Men characters a real chance to shine. Like Blink is in that show, and she's amazing in it. Polaris is a huge part of it. Thunderbird, who basically it's like because he's killed right away. He gets so much. He's such a big part of that show though, and it's really good. It's really good show.
Nice. Yeah, I'll have to put that on my list then.
Yeah. Back to this movie. There's just I'm trying to think of what I wanted to kind of jump on, just because there's so much to talk about here. But I guess Elliot Page is probably a good place to start as Kitty, because he is the Kitty was in all 3 of these movies, but it was just in cameos in the first 2. And it's kind of funny because you watch those movies in order, and it seems like each time they have a different actress playing Kitty, and it seems like each time they go younger.
Yeah. Elliot looks so young compared to the other 2. It's very weird. And it's kind of, I don't like the depiction of like Rogue and Iceman and Kitty all having this kind of weird love triangle, and then you're also shoehorning in like Rogue considering the cure just for Iceman to basically so she can, you know, kiss him or whatever. It's again, it does Rogue really dirty in this, but I think it was cool to see her see him in action as Kitty, and I think the effects for the kind of phasing through the walls was pretty good too. I felt like it held up pretty well, and of course the kind of iconic scene of Kitty fighting Juggernaut, and he's like, "I'm the Juggernaut, bitch."
Oh God, that line. I think that's the first example of a movie using a meme in and it's just like it's so cringeworthy. I mean,
yeah,
because I remember that video, and it was like it became unexpectedly popular and bizarrely so. Because it's you watch it now, it's like a lot of mumbling. It's like, "I'm the Juggernaut, bitch." I'm like, this is so stupid.
Yeah,
and I don't know who said like we have to try and put this in. Like, it's just it's so bad. It's so bad.
It's so bad, and like just that portion is very like something out of like a campy like superhero movie, whereas the rest of the film is it really kind of takes itself seriously, almost too much,
almost too seriously. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So I think if they would have marketed or made it more so like the kind of flashy, campy X-Men movie, then it would have worked. But
there's also there's also a weird idea of like where everything takes place in this movie, because it seems like I don't think Brett Ratner knows that the X-Men are based in New York and not California, because the Brotherhood seems to be in these like in the woods out in Northern California, because then they easily walk from their camp out to the Golden Gate Bridge to get to Alcatraz.
Yeah.
But Wolverine just easily comes in and then easily goes back to the mansion, no jet or anything. And then Kitty has that weird comment where she's talking to Bobby and she's like, "I miss home, the first snow." And I'm like, it snows in New York.
Yeah. I've always been confused by the location of everything in this movie. It's and you bring up a good point. Like Wolverine just kind of comes and goes at the camp, and you do make a good point about Kitty Pryde too. I was like, yeah, it snows really bad in New York. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and it is terrible.
I mean, we're not talking Midtown Manhattan. We're talking upstate New York. They live in.
Yeah.
So there's
So there absolutely would have been snow. But
yeah.
Whatever. Okay. Weird flex.
It is such that's a weird part, and just like the whole. Some of these mutants they introduce, like they bring in Callisto, but she's nothing like Callisto from the comics. They bring in Psylocke, and she like turns invisible or something, or I don't know what the hell's going on with her. And Kid Omega, who is not at all Kid Omega, he's Quill. It's just like all these characters, it's like they just had a grab bag of characters and a grab bag of powers, and they just mixed and matched.
Yeah, and going back to our earlier point about saving certain characters for certain movies, like I think that writing Psylocke is just some sort of, bottom level tier, like
Brotherhood member. Yeah.
Like it's a very weird route to take with her. And even when they introduce her in the later films, they never bring her back really.
Right, and they never give her anything really to do. And they're like, they do Psylocke so dirty in these movies.
Yeah. I think another one that they kind of underuse is Multiple Man, even though it is really cool what he does at the camp, but that's about it. That's all that he does. But yeah, they really kind of shuffled around the powers. They were like, let's do an automated generator and see what it spits out, and we'll just call this one Psylocke. Great.
Also, when Magneto and Pyro go to that mutant meeting in the church, and Callisto says to him, like, if you're so proud of being a mutant, where's your mark? That whole thing just came out of nowhere. I'm like, since when is having a tattoo of thing about mutant pride? That doesn't make any sense. That's never come in any of the movies before now.
Yeah, it's weirdly established, and I like that they had Magneto basically say, like, hey, I've been through some shit, like, don't fucking come for me. But it's so weird, and I feel like they kind of focus on it in the camp whenever Wolverine is like trying to infiltrate it, and they kind of do some close-ups of those tattoos on like the one guy's neck and stuff, and I'm like, what is the significance of this? It's not really like I get that they're against the cure, but I don't think you really need to establish, like, hey, they're this faction of mutants. I think we're smart enough, and I think we talked about this on the Morbius episode we did on my podcast. Like, the audience is smarter than the studios think.
Oh yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Like, we can kind of differentiate the different factions of mutants.
I feel like it was just done as a way to shoehorn in a reminder about the Holocaust stuff with Magneto's background.
True.
I really think that's the only, because it doesn't seem to have any other purpose beyond that, and it's just such a ham-fisted way to do it, because you introduce this whole concept of mutant branding that has never existed before in these movies.
Right, and I don't know if that's. I mean, they do that in the Days of Future Past. Like,
right, but it's not even a mark of mutant pride. It's a mark of it's like the Holocaust thing. It's exactly like it, where they're branding mutants for differentiation.
Right. So I don't know why. I don't know if it's trying to make a call back to that, but again, like you said, it's probably just a way to shoehorn in Magneto's backstory.
Well, I mean, talking about shoehorning,
again, we already know.
But talking about shoehorning in characters, Angel in this.
Oh god.
And they made such a big deal in the lead up to this movie about how they were going to introduce Angel. He's going to be a member of the team and everything. And he has like 2 beats in this movie, right? There's the scene where he's even in the opening credits scene where they show him as a young kid trying to cut off his wings. And it makes you think that he's going to be a big focus, and his father is in charge of the laboratory and creating the cure. And then literally the only thing he does is he jumps out the window, flies away, pops up randomly at the X-Mansion when inexplicably they're talking about closing the school suddenly. And then he just flies in at the end, swoops in, saves his dad, and that's it. And it's just, this was also a weird time with a lot of these Marvel movies, because almost every single Marvel movie that was coming out at this time had some sort of idea of like fathers and sons, like some sort of like conflict. Like you had David and Bruce in the Hulk movie. You had Warren and his father in this movie. You had the Blade movies had like these weird father-son dynamics stuff going on. And this is something Avi Arad was talking about a lot in interviews, and I'm just kind of like, it feels like you're really forcing up some of your own feelings about your own dad, because Warren Worthington II has no purpose in the comics. So why are you making him such a big part of this movie?
Yeah, it's very strange. And I think they could have utilized Angel a little more, maybe had him a part of the team, but instead he's just kind of peering around corners, listening to the X-Men team talk about going to his dad's lab. Like, that's literally the later half of the movie. He's just kind of standing there peering around the corner. And I'm like, I was like, come on, bro. Like, you gonna help or...
And too, like, I guess he flies all the way from New York to Alcatraz then too after that.
Yeah, well, he makes a round trip because he goes from California to New York and then comes back. So I guess he I don't know. I guess he knows how to fly, apparently, really well, because they don't really establish like how much he knows about his powers.
Right.
So it just seems strange that he's just so great at flying already.
Well, also the and just like the way they assembled the X-Men team here, because you've got Colossus in here, who, and I mean, you've got Colossus, you've got Juggernaut in the same movie, both at the same battle scene, and you don't have a Colossus and Juggernaut fight. It's such a missed opportunity. And like he has one line in this movie, and it's not even anything related to, and like it's a line that could have been given to any random character in the movie. And that's when Bobby asked him, "Have you seen Rogue?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, she took off." And that's it. That's the only thing he has to say.
Which is wild that Colossus is the only one that knows what happened to Rogue, aside from Wolverine, obviously. But like her own boyfriend doesn't check on her until midday and is like, "Hey, Rogue, I'm coming over," and and it's wild that Colossus is like the one person.
Just randomly, he's walking around carrying the TV. He's like, "Oh yeah, she left. Didn't you hear? She left."
Yeah, she said bye to me. She didn't say bye to you. Like, I watched that and I never really thought about it before. And I'm like, it's like midday. Like, did you not go say good morning to your girlfriend? Do you not sleep at least like close to each other? You know, you could, there's ways that you can make it work. But
yeah. It's such a missed opportunity. Well, also like when they go into this battle at the end, they know they're going up against an army. And they make this whole part about there's only 6 of us. But I'm like, you've got an entire school full of mutants. I'm like, that would have been, and this is supposed to be like this big all or nothing battle. Even I understand they're students, but that seems like a good opportunity to rally everybody together.
Yeah. And I think they could have at least attempted to find Rogue. Like, nobody cares that she left. They're like, oh, she went to go get the cure, whatever. You know, they could have utilized Angel. I'm trying to think of some other people. I mean, there's that girl that I guess she has similar powers to Banshee. Like,
Siren. That's Banshee.
Siren. Yeah, sorry. They could have utilized her. You know, any of them.
Jubilee, because I don't know where she appeared in the movie, but I did see in the credits that Kia Wong is credited as returning as Jubilee. So they could have had her in there as well. There are all these different characters you've seen in the background of these movies. You could have had some part for them.
Right. Yeah. It's just wild. And like we said before, it's just, you're saving some, but then you're relegating some of these, like Jubilee. I feel like you just came off of the 90s where Jubilee played a pretty big part in the animated series. They still could have like kind of shoehorned that in and really kind of capitalized on. I mean, I don't know how popular she really is with the fandom, but you know, at least for me, I would have been like, oh, cool. That would have been cool to see on screen with like the effects and stuff. But
well, I mean, that's another thing is like this movie is apparently like at the time, it was apparently like the most expensive movie ever made. And I'm watching it. And even like if you compare it to like the second movie, it looks cheap. Like it just looks cheap. It doesn't look like they spent a whole lot of money on it.
Yeah, it's like, where's all this money going? Is it to Kelsey Grammer's, like, you know, beast bodysuit, like, that he has to wear? Like, because, I mean, Mystique isn't in this a whole lot, so they couldn't have, you know, wasted all that on her, like, makeup and all that. But, which is, again, another character that's done dirty in this movie.
And in the ones after, too. Like, you know, I love Jennifer Lawrence as an actress, but unbelievable miscasting there. Yeah. I don't even know what X-Men character she would have been better at, but yeah, I think the actress who plays her, what's her name? Rebecca Romijn.
Rebecca Romijn. Yeah, I think she did a great job in the first 2 movies, and then in the third one, they just kind of have her locked up most of the time, and then she gets a cure.
I mean, I think we do get some good moments from her, though, like when she's talking to the guy in there, and she's, you know, like her speech about you know, Like all that, I think she does a pretty good job in what little she's given in this movie.
Right.
In fact, I'd say I'd put it on par with her performance in the second movie, because the second movie was probably the best we've seen of Mystique to date.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so I think Rebecca Romaine in the second movie was great, and I wish we could have seen more of that, as far as her like fight scenes and such. Because I think in the second movie, like you said, it's probably the best we've ever seen her.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think more of that in this movie probably. But again, the plot was busy enough already that probably just throwing Mystique in there to
Right.
shape shift at the end battle probably wouldn't have worked. But
Yeah.
who knows?
What do you think of Jackman's performance in this?
I like Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, but I think at this point I was a little exhausted of just kind of them shoving Wolverine down our throats. And, and as the years went on, they continued to beat a dead horse in a way. But I think in this movie, it just wasn't as good as the rest, as the other two. I think it's just kind of, it's a little one note, and I think because the plot isn't necessarily centered around him, because I feel like the first two movies, it's really centered around his backstory.
Right.
So there's a little more emotion coming through for Wolverine, but in this movie, he's just kind of like love-stricken by Jean, and that's basically his entire storyline.
Yeah, and Jackman's a great actor, but there's only so much he can do with when he's given garbage material like this. And I look at that that scene right before they get on the jet and they go to face off against Magneto and the Brotherhood, where he gives that speech about being X-Men, and it's so forced. It does not ring true to that character at all. And Jackman clearly knows that as he's delivering the lines, because he's trying to deliver them with earnestness and with feeling, but it's clear even he doesn't really buy into these lines. And there's another cut of that scene where Iceman actually gives that speech to Logan, and it works much better. But they chose to do it again and do it with Wolverine giving that speech because, he's the main character, so he's got to give the big speech at the end.
Yeah. And maybe that would have been a better opportunity to have Halle Berry do that, because
that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, they're trying to set her up to be the person that takes over the school, which I think would have worked. I mean, that's clearly where you're, driving the plot, and I think it would have given Halle Berry a little bit more oomph to the character, because at this point, again, it's like garbage material for Storm too. So she's just kind of standing there as like a second in command to Wolverine somehow, even though she's been at the school for much longer. But
well, I mean, there's the whole idea of you could if you're serious about committing to the Dark Phoenix storyline, you've got an opportunity here to play up Jean and Storm's friendship, which has not been touched on enough in these movies. But the fact that she is like that speech she gives to Logan when he's, getting ready to go out for Jean, she's like, oh, she made her choice. She turned against us and all that. Like that's not Storm. I guess it just kept what I thinking was when she's delivering that speech. And then right before she goes onto the jet, she takes Wolverine aside. She's like, are you ready to do what you have to do? And she's basically saying like, you're the one, I'm telling you to go kill Jean. And I'm just like, that is, again, that's not Storm. Like it's Storm.
Again, it's definitely not Storm's personality at all. And it's funny to me. I was just thinking about this, like the accent that Halle Berry uses for Storm in the first movie. It just kind of fades away, and so she's just talking in her normal voice.
Yeah.
In the third movie.
Oh yeah, because
that really kind of cracked me up.
After the first movie, like I think it was when they were filming the second movie, singers like don't use the accent.
Yeah. I think they really should have played up that friendship, like you said, of Jean and Storm, and I think it would have maybe helped the story a little bit, but and I don't think they even really do that in the Dark Phoenix movie either.
No, not at all.
2019, yeah, like it's just basically like she's just there again.
Yeah, none of that stuff is touched on at all in either of those movies. And just like this, even McKellen just seems, he tries to do the best he can with what he's given, but he just seems kind of bored with this material in this movie.
And I would be too. Like, I feel like the first two, like Magneto's like definitely doing a lot. They're showcasing his powers more, and again in the second movie, I feel like we see that full force. But I just read before we hopped on, I think he was working on the Da Vinci Code, and then he was also doing some theater in London as well. So I guess some of these scenes, which I couldn't tell, but I guess he had to do some filming in England, and then they just kind of superimpose him in the scene, which now reading that and kind of thinking about it, I'm like, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
In some of those scenes, he doesn't seem like he's really connecting with who he's talking to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just, he just seems so, and this script is such a bad treatment of Magneto as a character, because he's just, he just seems very, a lot of the grandeur we got, especially in the second movie, is just completely lost in this one, and he just feels very, very one note in this movie.
Yeah, I would agree. It's very one note. He's just kind of flouncing around in the cape, just like throwing it over his shoulder every 2 seconds. You know, it's and he's just kind of making these grand speeches, which, you know, Magneto is known to do from time to time. But that's pretty much all he's doing in this film.
Well, now one of the big criticisms a lot of people had of this was how they depicted the Phoenix as like an outgrowth of Jean's powers and all that, instead of like the cosmic force. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually thought that makes sense for the world that's established in these movies, because, you know, these movies, they're trying to be very grounded, and as good as the Dark Phoenix Saga is as a story, I do feel that it's not my favorite X-Men story. My favorite X-Men story is actually God Loves, Man Kills, because I feel like that really centers that central idea of what the X-Men are about, that conflict between human and mutants, that idea of prejudice and all that. That's what the X-Men is all about. It's fun when the X-Men go off to space, but it has nothing to do with that core concept of what the X-Men are. So I feel like them taking that story idea, and then instead it's Jean's powers, you know, basically going out of control. I think it makes a lot more sense as a plot, as a way to root in this idea of human mutant relations, this idea of also that whole speech that Xavier gives when he's given the class on mutant ethics, talking about, you know, what are the ethics of having these superhuman powers. Again, that's stuff when I'm like, that should really be the driving force behind this movie. Because also that scene when the president says to Beast, you know, I wonder how democracy can survive when one man can move cities with his mind. These are good questions. These are very good questions. And like when the civil rights metaphor and the prejudice metaphor and all that with the X-Men, the metaphor only goes so far, because eventually you get to a point where whether you're gay or whether you're trans or whether you're black or Hispanic or what, that doesn't give you any extra abilities, right? Like if you're but if you're a mutant, like it's one thing to say, I don't want my kid being taught by a black man or a gay man. It's another thing to say, I don't want my kid being taught by someone who might shoot lasers out of their eyes uncontrollably.
Right.
And there's a very good question to have. Like, I think one of I remember in the first movie when Senator Kelly's giving this speech in Congress about mutants, and when he's talking about, you know, here's a girl who can walk through walls. What's to stop her from walking into a bank vault or to anyone's home and taking whatever she wants? I'm like, that's a good question, and that poses there's a real debate to be had about mutant powers and the idea of mutant registration, because as a fan, as a reader of this, I get the metaphor there, and obviously I side with the X-Men in that, and that registration is bad. But in real life, if my neighbor had the ability to blow up a city block, I think that's something the government should probably keep an eye on.
Yeah. Yeah, at least just have like some sort of database of like, hey, this person has this ability. We're not taking any action, but just kind of keep an eye on it. But going back to your point about the Phoenix Saga being presented in this way, I think you're right. It does make sense in this universe, and I think that was a good way to kind of introduce that idea. And of course, now that we have again the MCU and like Guardians of the Galaxy really kind of put that in perspective, that these heroes can go into space, and like Infinity War and Endgame after that, obviously. Now and then we see them try to attempt it with Dark Phoenix, and then it doesn't really work. So and they make the same mistake in that trilogy of introducing Jean's powers as like she already has the Phoenix Force, and then goes and says, "Oh, she got it from space," right after.
But it was such a weird way to do it, because I to the life of me, even I've seen Dark Phoenix now like maybe 3 or 4 times, and I still can't tell if the Phoenix is Jean or if it's this cosmic force, because it seems like it's both. It's such a bizarre way to do it.
Yeah. And again, I think they just made the same mistake that they made as far as using the same writer who was already doing these things for the original trilogy, instead of having a fresh set of eyes come in and be like, okay, let's kind of take a better look at this.
And just some of the direction in this is just really kind of all over the place. Like that scene when Wolverine goes to the camp, there's that scene where he's fighting, I guess that's supposed to be Spike. And there's this weird kind of tracking shot where they're running at each other and he's throwing the bones. It's like kind of like this low angle, and then you got Wolverine and it's like he's cutting, and it's just like, it looks so bad. I'm just like, every time I watch it, I'm like, this is just so, I hesitate to use the word unartistic, but I can't really think of a better way to say it. It's just, it looks so clumsy.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't feel like we've ever gotten that in the other 2 movies. Maybe there's some of it, but I feel like it's better shot.
Oh yeah,
for the action, that you can't really tell. But it's very egregious in some of these shots. And the battle at the end, I think, it's just all these mutants running towards the 6, and it's like 4 or 5 different copycats of Nightcrawler, and I'm thinking, like, why is it Nightcrawler in this movie?
It's like, it's such an uncreative fight scene, especially when, now I know we're talking differences of scale here, but if you compare it to like the battles in like the Avengers movies, where you see characters using these different abilities, and you get a little bit of that with the X-Men, but not a whole lot. I think honestly, Kitty and Iceman are probably the ones who have the most creative uses of their powers, and even that's not very creative.
Yeah. and it's kind of frustrating, because for someone like Iceman, like, you want to see him like do his little what do you call, like, surfing on
the ice slide.
The ice slide. Yeah, you want to see him doing those things that we've seen in the comics, and these 3 movies just kind of establish him as like, he doesn't know what he's doing, which I think would have been a better arc for him if they just showed him using his powers a little bit more every time, in a more creative use, I guess.
I mean, I'm glad that we did get to see his ice form in this, but it looks, I mean, it looks kind of bad though, but it's still nice that they had attempted to it. And honestly, the best use of his powers was probably in Days of Future Past, because we see him ice up, we see him using the
I
ice
was gonna
slide in
say
that.
that.
Yeah. And like Colossus, it's so weird because he looks so good in that brief scene in X2, and it looks so cheap in this movie.
Yeah, I don't know where, like you said, it was the most expensive superhero movie at the time, and I have no
Yeah.
idea where any of the money went. Like it certainly wasn't the effects.
He's like
I'll tell you that much.
somebody put some money in their pocket. I'm telling you that much right now.
or they paid they paid Sir Ian McKellen a lot of
Yeah,
fucking money to
yeah.
just stand in front of a green screen in
Yeah.
London
Well, I mean,
to
and
film some of these shots.
continuing that, I mean, like the Dark Phoenix effects too. I mean, like you've got the Dark Phoenix, you've got this iconic imagery associated with her of the flaming Firebird. Not once do you ever use it, and it's just like she's got these black eyes and like these like veiny things, and there's just like this bright backlight, and that's it. Like it was insulting almost.
Yeah, and I thought today, like, obviously, me doing a horror movie podcast, it kind of puts me in this frame of mind. But it looks like something out of maybe The Ring or The Grudge or something like that. Just kind of that imagery of like scary girl with long hair.
Yeah,
it's not a great use. And like you said, it's just such like that imagery of her popping out of the water and being like, I am Phoenix. Like they really should have played that up a little more.
Especially,
I know they kind of do it.
Well, yeah,
but
especially because the last movie ended on that shot where you start to vaguely see the Firebird in the water, and then you're not going to use it at all in this movie.
Yeah, it's a shame. Out of everything, I think that's probably one of the biggest missed opportunities, especially since it is a story centered around the Phoenix. Like you're not even going to use any sort of fiery effects at all.
Yeah, I mean, but even in Dark Phoenix, again, they have the opportunity to do it again. They still don't really do it in Dark Phoenix either. It's just they're making the same mistakes.
Yeah, and I feel like they do it more in the Apocalypse movie.
Yeah,
like,
honestly,
that's the only time we ever see her in that kind of like Firebird Phoenix form. Like,
and then it disappears for 10 years because those movies are 10 years apart.
Yeah, like I guess she just never uses her powers again. It's so frustrating. They do my girl Jean so dirty.
Oh, absolutely.
All the time.
Yeah. And again, and like you said, Famke Janssen she gives such a good performance in these movies, and it's just it's so disappointing that we never got to see, because one of the biggest through lines of that Dark Phoenix story is that Scott and Jean relationship. Like that anchors that story so much, and it's just like that is all completely gone in this movie because you don't because you kill off Scott like the first chance you get, and then you just have it with Logan, and it just doesn't work the same way. It doesn't have that same emotional resonance.
Yeah, and I think if Scott was kept alive and maybe it was I think that works better as a love triangle, obviously, just based on the history of the comics, instead of the Iceman Kitty Rogue love triangle. I think they should have just played with that. But I think you mentioned a little bit with the conversation about Superman Returns, like James Marsden is in that movie. So obviously that's part of the reason why, he's killed off so early. But it's such a shame. Like I feel like a better way to end this is having Cyclops be the one that's like obviously killing off Jean or saving her in some way. So
I think one of the biggest sins, especially now that we can look back on all these X-Men movies as a whole, there are two big sins about these movies. First off is there's a lot of people involved who do not care much about the source material. Like you watch the MCU movies, and there are legitimate criticisms to be had about those movies. There are questions to be raised about some of the decisions they made. But one thing you cannot deny is that the people involved in those movies, they care about the source material. There's a definite affection for that source material you can see in those movies. Same thing with, you mentioned Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Same thing with that. There's a lot of questionable decisions Sam Raimi made in that original trilogy, but that love of Spider-Man, that affection for the source material, still drips off the screen in every single frame of it. These movies, you can tell they're made by people who did not care about the source material.
Yeah. And I think even right down to just putting the X-Men in just plain black suits, which I know kind of references, I believe it's the Ultimate timeline, kind of from
So
like the
that's
late 90s, early 2000s, right?
well, kind of. It's we're kind of dealing with a chicken and egg situation here because the movies came out before the Ultimate books did.
Okay.
But
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean, I understand putting the X-Men in black leather. I'm a bit of an apologist for that. Like, I'm not saying it's the best idea, but I'm saying I can justify it more than I can if you were trying to do this with, like, say Spider-Man or the Avengers, because
Sure.
the X-Men are a team. This whole idea of them being kind of like this search and rescue organization that works for what the X-Men are. Them being this school, having these training kids and all that. All of that kind of fits together with like this, and especially at the time period, right? Because you got to remember this is 2000 that first movie came out, and up until that point, like the last big superhero movies before this were Batman and Robin and Spawn, which were both, terrible. And so like, and especially with like the gaudiness and all that. So there was a huge backlash to the idea of making things too superhero-y. I think like at that time, the audience wouldn't have really been ready for that. X-Men serves as kind of it serves as a nice transitional movie to get people more interested in the superhero stuff. So I can understand why they went with the black leather at the time. I think it made sense for the time period. I'm not saying they should always do it, but I think it makes sense for what they were doing at the time and the kind of environment they were facing. And this idea of we want to change the public perception of superhero movies as not being something that looks goofy, but as something that looks serious. And then they did, like, I say this, X-Men walked so Spider-Man could run. Right? Because you went from the X-Men movies with the black leather and the superhero ideas and kind of a ground, and then you go to Spider-Man where he's in the classic costume, he's swinging around, and people buy into it. And I think that's so. I'm a defender of the black leather costumes. I don't think they're great. I still think I do think that when they do reboot the X-Men, they should give them more comics accurate costumes. But I understand it for the time frame they were facing.
Yeah, you bring up some good points. I kind of forgot. 22 years later, you kind of, especially with MCU, we've been so spoiled that like watching it now, you're like, why did they put him in black leather? It clearly doesn't work. Well, it does work, but it's for me. I would rather obviously see the kind of colorful costumes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's especially now. Like you look at them, especially it was a weird choice because at the end of Apocalypse, they give the X-Men those costumes, and then in Dark Phoenix they completely do away with them, and I just didn't understand what was the point of that.
So frustrating.
but now we're at a point where people are willing to accept this stuff. So you can have like the Avengers in these more colorful costumes. You can have the Justice League and all that. And when we get the X-Men back, I mean, we saw in Multiverse of Madness, they had Professor X on the hover chair. So I think when they do get around to having more X-Men stuff, I think we'll see the more comics accurate costumes come back. Although, and I will die on this hill, I do not think Wolverine should wear the mask. I friggin' hate that mask. It's just, I think that character's got such an iconic look without the mask that you don't need it.
Yeah, and I would say Wolverine in these movies, I feel like they treat with such care, and and he's pretty accurate to the comics in the sense of like the kind of ruggedness and like the jeans, the wife beater tank, and the leather jacket or whatever. So I definitely agree with you. They shouldn't do the mask, and I think it would look kind of ridiculous on screen.
I think so too. Yeah,
probably. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do. My hope is that they kind of treat the Dark Phoenix Saga kind of like how they did the Infinity Saga, and kind of build it up and incorporate the Hellfire Club and incorporate maybe some of those the cosmic aspects like in Guardians of the Galaxy and
Right.
such. And I think it's kind of laying that groundwork, but yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. What storylines do you think that they should do for the MCU?
Well, I want to get to that, but one thing I want to say, because I said
okay.
I said there are two big sins that these movies had. The first one was about the comic, the lack of faithfulness to the comics, or the lack of people involved who actually cared about the comics. The second biggest sin of these movies is they forget that the strength of the X-Men has always been that ensemble nature. And like you said very accurately, they focus a lot on Wolverine in these movies. And then in the later movies, they focus a lot on Professor X and Magneto. And it's at the expense of everything else. Like, there's so much focus on those three characters. And the Dark Phoenix story only works, again, if you have that emotional resonance of the Jean Scott relationship. Without that story doesn't work. And you can't do Dark Phoenix, where Jean is basically a supporting character in her own. Jean and Scott are supporting characters in their own big romantic tragedy, and then but then the heart of the story is still about Wolverine or Professor X and Magneto. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and I think making it a 2-part film so that they can kind of flesh out everything, and including those aspects of Wolverine and Magneto and Professor X. Like I think it would have boded well as a 2-parter, but again, this was before. I feel like Harry Potter kind of started that trend of doing, their last film is kind of like a big 2-parter, and then like Hunger Games did that, and I think Twilight did it too. Some of those movies were better off split into 2 parts. But,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Again, it was before the time.
Well, yeah, it's the same thing with Dark Phoenix. I mean, you first had to have a movie establishing what the Phoenix is, how it comes to Jean, how Jean deals with that power, and then you do the corruption in the second movie. That's really, I mean, honestly, I think the best way to do an X-Men, to do the X-Men now would be to do because the strength of the X-Men has always been those soap opera dynamics, those character interactions. Yeah. It's hard to do that in a 2 or even 3 hour movies set a few years apart. But what you could do, and I think this would probably be the best thing to do, is first off, I'd have solo Wolverine movies. I think Wolverine, I'd have him come in for like some of these X-Men stuff, but I think save like the big Wolverine centric stuff for his own stories. He can anchor a franchise on his own. And there's so much stuff you can explore there, especially now that we have Madripoor in the MCU. I love Madripoor in the comics. There's so much stuff you could do with Wolverine and Madripoor. We've got the Hand in the movies in the MCU now. You could do stuff with that too. All that stuff would be a lot better explored in solo Wolverine movies. But honestly, if you're looking at the X-Men as a franchise, I think what you do is you have TV shows like on Disney Plus or something, have like 6 to 9 episode seasons or something, and then cap them off with movies. I think is probably the best way to do it. So you have these character dynamics. You get to see the characters interact. You get to have them go up against, some of these other different villains. So we don't have to have Magneto in every goddamn movie. And you can explore things like, because you don't need a big 2-hour blockbuster movie to tell God Loves, Man Kills. You could easily do that over the course of a season of TV. I think it would probably be better served over the course of a season of TV. And then you save something like Dark Phoenix Saga for a movie is really, I think, how you do that.
Yeah, I agree. And even like Days of Future Past could probably be a good storyline
for
TV too. And I think the film version of that could. I have thoughts about Kitty Pryde being, the
that was so weird. She can phase through time.
Yeah, she can phase through time somehow. Okay, cool, great. But yeah, I think that storyline would be better served as a TV show.
Well, I mean, I think
I think this
did
kind
you
of
ever
building
watch?
up.
Did you ever watch the Heroes TV series on NBC?
Oh yeah, it's been a long time, but yeah.
But that's a good example of like that verse. They dealt a lot with like the future stuff and all that in there, and I feel like because
Yeah.
one of my biggest issues with I love Days of Future Past as a movie. I wouldn't say love, I like it a lot,
Yeah.
but it's one of the things that I felt was like the biggest weakness is they spend so much time in the 70s era where I think the future period was so much more interesting, and I wanted to see more about how we get from the end of the Wolverine to this time period in Days of Future Past. And
Yeah.
I would have been so much more interested to see them explore that world, but they don't have enough time, and they got to put most of the focus on the stuff in the 1970s. So, and I feel like if you had a TV show, you could really dig into a lot of that. You can do episodes that are set completely in the future and all of that stuff. And it'd be, yeah, that would make a great season of TV.
Yeah, absolutely. And
especially because when you look at that original story, it's not even that much of a big budget affair. Like we think of it now as one of the most iconic X-Men stories, but it's not like Dark Phoenix levels of spectacle, right? It's just the Brotherhood trying to kill a senator, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. And I think it would be cool and maybe split it up into 2 seasons, like really kind of, and then like the kind of end cap or cliffhanger of that first season of it would be them killing the senator, and then it kind of goes into the crazy future time period, and then them trying to fix it.
Yeah, you could do a lot of stuff with that. Or even like if you ever saw Wolverine and the X-Men, the TV series, they had also done a lot of stuff with the future as well. And then and they were when they were planning on doing a second season, they were going to do the Age of Apocalypse. That's something else you could play with over a season of TV or so.
Absolutely. Another storyline kind of piggybacking off of the Phoenix Saga is them eventually doing I think it's the Avengers versus X-Men timeline where like Cyclops and Emma Frost and all them get, I think they're the Phoenix 5 or something.
Right, yeah.
I think that would be really cool as like an end cap movie for the X-Men. I think that would be cool.
I think it'd be cool, but I think it's something that's something that's got to come like 10 years down the line.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was my next point. I was like, they got to get the Phoenix Saga right first.
Yeah.
At this point, we don't have very big hope.
Right, yeah. I mean, also, I think one of the things that the MCU, I thought a lot about how the MCU should introduce mutants. I know everybody is saying, like, oh, it's the multiverse. Just bring I think that's just such a lazy way of doing it. I think based on what we've seen now, I've had this idea since before, but based on what we've seen in WandaVision now, I think this is much more likely, is that mutants have always existed in some form, and we kind of get a little bit more of that because if you've seen Wakanda Forever, Namor says that I'm a mutant. He specifically says he's announcing himself as Marvel's first mutant. And the end of Ms. Marvel, right? They have that cliffhanger where they say like your powers are a mutation. It's not So we know that mutants exist now, and they've existed. So I think my thing is like mutants have existed for a while in small numbers, and then in WandaVision we saw that the Infinity Stone didn't necessarily give her powers because there's a pretty obvious hint that she had them before when she was a little kid. So there's this idea that I think the Infinity Stones have been able to kickstart mutation, especially because now we've had 3 snaps on Earth. So all that cosmic energy flowing through the Earth, I think it's very easy to say like that's jump-started mutation. So what I would say is that for all these years, you've had Xavier and Magneto on Krakoa gathering mutants in secret, maybe with Nick Fury's help or something like that. Now there's been a sudden explosion of mutants. So now they're appearing everywhere. And so now that's bringing them out into the open.
Yeah. I think that would be a really cool way to bring that in. And I'm glad that they're kind of slowly introducing that idea and bringing up like WandaVision and Multiverse of Madness. I feel like the Scarlet Witch that we've seen so far is kind of a better depiction in a way of the craziness of Phoenix than these two movies.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Because Scarlet Witch in a way is kind of the same kind of tragic character as Jean Grey in a way whenever she gets the Phoenix Force. So the two of them are kind of one and the same in that regard in some ways. So I thought that was funny that in Multiverse of Madness, I'm like, wow, this is very much a Phoenix storyline.
Very similar ideas. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Josh, do you have any final things to say about The Last Stand? I think I've pretty much tapped out on what I had to say about it.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I in this rewatch, I'm not as critical as I probably would have been had we talked about it 10 years ago. But overall, it's a fun watch, even though some of the parts of this movie are kind of boring, like the big grand speeches from certain characters.
Yeah,
but overall, it's a good watch. It's not the greatest way to end this trilogy, but
I think, I mean, for me, it's still, Kelsey Grammer is still the best. I thought of this then, I think it now. Kelsey Grammer is still the best thing about this movie. I mean, if you've seen this movie and, you're wondering if you should watch it again, I'd say, honestly, just, see if you can find a supercut on YouTube of all the beast scenes would probably be best.
Yeah.
Because, it's just, he's so good in these movies. And it seems like, and I'm hoping that when if we get Beast in the MCU, that we'll get more of this Beast and not so much the Nicholas Hoult, stereotypical, shy nerd milksop that he played.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's hope that they do that. And, bring back somebody like Rebecca
Romijn.
Thank you. my brain, yeah, I'm really tired. Sorry. I've been moving a lot. Anyway, yeah, Rebecca Romijn as Mystique was great in this trilogy. So I feel like bringing back her, or maybe somebody like her that can achieve this kind of like acrobatics and like sensuality of Mystique, I think is a great way to go. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think recasting is probably the best thing to do, because especially,
oh, sure.
I mean, I know everybody wants to see Hugh Jackman back, and I know he's going to be in Deadpool 3. But honestly, I think there's also rumors that they're going to be bringing in a bunch of other former Marvel actors for Secret Wars, and that's fine for that. Kind of like DC did with Crisis on Infinite Earths. That's cool to bring them in for like one last hurrah type thing. But I think overall, it's better if we just kind of like recast, because I mean, Jackman's in his 50s now, and he can't keep doing that to his body. Let the guy take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, let him play some other characters for once. Like this poor man has been, beaten the freaking Wolverine horse to death.
Yeah.
And I mean, Logan is such a great movie.
Oh yeah.
But I was so happy when they were like, okay, we're putting it to rest. No more, and even with Patrick Stewart at that point too, it's like he was doing it for so long. It's like, how much more can he really do with the character?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was so cool to see him in Multiverse of Madness, but the entire time I'm watching, I'm just thinking like, this poor guy needs to take a break. Like he's just he's just too old for this role anymore now.
Yeah, and obviously it was just more so like a cameo thing, but just to bring him on for like a whole 2 seconds and Wanda rips him apart. It's just so sad,
I did love that they had the little X-Men guitar riff though when he came in.
Oh yeah, that was just like mwah, chef's kiss.
Well, actually, that's a good thing to end on. Do you have any ideas for anyone who you would like to see play the X-Men when the MCU brings them in?
Oh, I don't know. I have a feeling that they're going to try to cast young just so that they can, have the longevity of the franchise. But I almost want to say, bring in some actors that are in their 30s and 40s, kind of like they did with the 2000 movie, and kind of bring them in when they're a little older and kind of do what they did introducing Tom Holland as Spider-Man, like we kind of know the origin of X-Men at this point, that we don't really need to kind of do like a first class per se
Right.
of like an origin story. So I'm kind of hoping they go that route. I'm trying to think. There's
I mean, I don't like some of the names.
I can't really think of any of.
I mean, some of the names
go
I've
ahead,
seen
sorry.
floated around. Like I've seen people talk. These may sound weird, but I've seen people talking about Daniel Radcliffe or Zac Efron. And honestly, looking up some photos of them, what they look like now, Radcliffe's pretty scruffy looking. He could probably do it.
Yeah, honestly, and hell, maybe bring in Channing Tatum, but maybe not as Gambit.
Maybe not as Gambit. Yeah, I don't think that was a good choice, even when he was younger.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe him as Colossus, or any kind of like beefcake that just insert him as Colossus. But yeah, do you have any a kind of wish list or anything?
Not really. I mean, I do hope they go younger. I think it might be interesting to see Fassbender back as Magneto. I think that might be the one person I would probably want to see come back.
Yeah,
because he's right now he's probably at the right age where you can have him, give him bleach his hair or something, and then have him play Magneto going forward. I think he could probably pull that off pretty convincingly now, more so than he did then, and he was the best part of those other movies too. So
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what they do as far as the Magneto Scarlet Witch relationship. They probably will forego that, I imagine.
I'm not so sure because I know they undid it in the comics, but they only undid it in the comics because at the time it was because Fox had the rights to the X-Men, and Ron Perlman, who's in charge of Marvel, he had kind of like this feud with them, so he's like, no X-Men, no mutant stuff related to the Avengers at all. So it was that whole kind of, and so that it was like this very kind of petty idea. Hold on one sec.
No worries.
But yeah, there's this and so I think, and like they've kind of, I'm not sure if you're up to date on the X-Men comics now, but they had done the Trial of Magneto storyline, and in that, Wanda had said basically, even though you're not my biological father, I still think of you as my father. So there's kind of like this, I think they're kind of starting to reestablish those familial bonds between them. So I think that now that Marvel has all the rights to it, I think that when they bring in Magneto, they will go down that route. I don't expect them not to. Yeah.
And obviously looking back at Age of Ultron, like I wish they wouldn't have killed off Quicksilver so quick.
Yeah, he especially like he was. I love ATJ as Quicksilver. I thought that was such perfect casting.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see what they do with it.
Well, Josh, thanks so much for coming on. Why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. You can find me at Super Scary Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can follow me on my regular socials at glossy_not-matt. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We release new episodes on my podcast every Monday, wherever you find your podcasts. I did an episode with Perry in January, so that's my first episode of my second season. So we do a lot of good stuff over there. Yeah, check us out.
Yeah. So I think based on the schedule, this episode, when people are listening, this will be in March, so you can go back and listen to the Morbius discussion we had. Or you can also go back to the episode I did on here when we talked about Morbius with John Brasek. So you can go back and listen to that too, and pair them up together.
Yeah, pair those two together, and it'll probably be more entertaining than the actual film.
Yeah, yeah, probably. All right, Josh, thanks so much for coming on, and more than welcome to come back on anytime you like.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
See you soon.
Thank you. That does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And if you subscribe to our Patreon page, then you get these episodes a week in advance. Plus, you get access to the the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club podcast, where we talk about comics and graphic novels, all that fun stuff. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoyed the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.